In the early 80s, I worked at a Boy Scout camp in Ohio. Kids would always be doing stuff in the wee hours of the morning because they were kids. Part of my job was to pretend to care about getting them to go back to their tents and sleep, primarily because if they didn't, they would be tired the next day and not want to do Boy Scout stuff. One night, we were informed by a scout leader that some kids had run off and were missing. I headed out with a flashlight, very familiar with the camp area, and most kids would end up in the same general areas, and weren't too good at staying quiet. I spent a solid hour looking for them, and I was starting to get pissed since, by now, most kids would have given up and gone to bed. It was almost 2 a.m. I asked on the radio if the kids had been found, and was told they hadn't been. A little while later, I thought I saw something. I got a weird feeling, so I stopped moving and panned the flashlight around. It was the kids, all huddled together and crouched down. They were scared out of their minds and crying. There were 7 of them in total, all at least 12, and most of them closer to 15 or 16. I walked towards them and asked what was wrong because they were clearly spooked. They wouldn't talk to me. I got on the radio and told the other workers where I was and that I'd found the kids. Eventually, one of them started blubbering, trying to tell me what they saw. He described some terrible monster or ghost or something. I couldn't understand half of what he was saying. When the other worker got there, we got the kids to their feet by physically pulling them up and making them walk back to their tents. I was up past 4 a.m., talking first to the boys and their leaders, then to the camp director, who was mad we had woken him up, and finally to the police, who made me walk back out to where I found the kids. I still don't know what spooked those kids, but they all demanded they go home, and they did the next afternoon. When I was about 11, I went on a Boy Scout jamboree, which is essentially just a meetup of all the Boy Scout groups on the island. It was held in the middle of Terra Nova Park, which is a large provincial park filled with campgrounds and woods. The theme of this jamboree was magical mysteries. They copied the demerits and points thing from Harry Potter, and everything had a magical theme. On activity day, our group decided to do the blind trail walk. We got blindfolded and, one at a time, walked down the trail. At different points, older kids would guide us through some obstacle, crawl under this, climb over that. I got to one point where I had to walk across a log over a ditch. An older kid explained it to me, then said and did nothing. I walked across the log and almost fell, but I felt him hold my arm and help me across. I said, "Thanks," and received no answer. I continued walking a few feet and felt him poke me in the ribs. I said, "Hey, stop." I said, "Hey, stop." Then I felt him poke me in the back, and I heard giggling. It sounded like a girl giggling as well. I felt another poke in the ribs and started to get annoyed. I ripped off my blindfold, and nobody was there. I looked back at the log. The older kid was like 150 feet down the trail, helping up a kid who had fallen over. I live in a very rural part of New England, and let me tell you, the woods are a very large part of who we are out here. Me and my friends have had many adventures, but one of the most interesting ones wasn't really paranormal. But maybe it was. There's a really old chunk of land which was cleared out to build a reservoir, and a lot of people were displaced because of it. The company in charge simply bought everyone out, then created the reservoir to help supply Boston. Well, there's some local legends that state that not everyone left, and some people took to living out in the woods. So we snuck in one night with plans to travel to one of the islands that got created. We had an old map of the way the town was situated prior to being flooded, and decided to try to find the ruins of some of the old buildings that were rumored to exist on the untouched islands. The reservoir itself is open to the public, but people aren't allowed on the islands. So, in the dead of night, we managed to sneak in, hide our car, and drag our raft to the shore, where we made it to the island. We began exploring a bit, but it was dark, and one of my friends began to pitch the tent. 3 of us went off and found the remnants of the old church that stood there. We found some pretty interesting stuff, but nothing too shocking or scary until late at night, when we were sitting around the campsite talking in our sleeping bags. A light flashed through the woods. We thought that maybe some of the park patrol had spotted our car, or the trail the raft had made in the sand, and were coming to look for us. So we stayed low and kept quiet. We waited, but the light didn't move or get any closer. So one of my friends got out of his sleeping bag and started creeping towards the source. The light was coming from another of the uninhabited islands, and didn't appear to be coming from any particular place. It shone for about an hour until the sun started to peek up, and it disappeared. I was at summer camp back in high school, spending 2 weeks in the middle of Vesuvius, Virginia, which is the middle of nowhere. It was a beautiful area, though, in the George Washington National Forest. This happened on the night after the ghost stories. We had separate cabins for the boys and the girls, and they had the bunks faced away from the screen windows. Your back would be either to the road of the camp or the woods. I felt something really foreboding that night while trying to sleep. Like if I closed my eyes, I wouldn't open them again. I knew this feeling, and it was usually just that, a feeling. The stories for this camp were pretty standard. You have the swamp monster, and the camp cook who was stabbed with a meat hook. Except, the people in this story actually exist. There are pictures. The alcoholic cook who was stabbed through did actually die, and they did find alcohol bottles during the renovations of the kitchen roof. He was actually really nice with the campers while he was there, and the story describes encounters with what might be his ghost. He was also a musician, and would play the pipe reed organ in the dining hall and a harmonica near the medical building. Anyway, I was trying to sleep while listening to the sounds of the woods. It was probably about midnight now, or later, and I still couldn't get to sleep. I couldn't hear any footsteps on the gravel road, but suddenly, I started hearing organ music, which played for a good minute, fading in and out. I was barely able to sleep that night. When I woke up, I asked some other campers about it, and a few remembered hearing it. I don't know who it could have been, because I heard no footsteps that night. This isn't really that spooky, I guess, but I had a pretty weird feeling here, and it was very unsettling. I was 17 and riding ATVs in southern West Virginia with my grandpa and his neighbor. We were riding for miles down this road into the middle of nowhere. We were a solid hour-and-a-half drive from any stores or anything you could even almost call civilization. We hadn't passed any houses or anything for 30 or 40 minutes. It wasn't even really a road anymore. just a path in the woods that you couldn't even fit a car down. After a while, I noticed barbed wire lining the edge of the path. We came to a clearing in the trees, and in this small opening, there was a 10x10 camper that looked like it had been there for decades, and barbed wire around the whole property. We kept going since that wasn't why we were there. After another 2 or 3 miles, we started going uphill to the top of a mountain. All of a sudden, I started to notice graves lining the road, and we came to a stop. My grandpa explained that 75 years ago, there was a town out here that was abandoned after a mine collapse. All of the graves were from the late 1800s to the 1910s. Most of them were caved in because they just used wooden boxes for coffins. Several were too close to the edge of the cliff, and the coffins had fallen out because of the side of the cliff eroding. I looked down and saw 4 or 5 smashed coffins, with no signs of bones or human remains anywhere around them. It turns out there are actually a bunch of these random creepy cemeteries in the woods by my grandpa's house. It's always really creepy when you stumble onto one while riding.